Hello again, everyone. So today, I thought I would sort of try to quickly tackle 5 common misconceptions about fairies that I run into. Trying to be a little fancier today, so I actually have it's as fancy as I'm going to get here. So, 5 common misconceptions about fairies. I apologize now because I still haven't been able to find anyone to do transcriptions for me. I'm still working on that. I hope to offer them again in the future. I know how important they are for people who would rather read the material than listen to me talk. At the moment, though, still not having any luck figuring out a way to get it done. So we do have the closed caption option on the videos. I realize they're not 100% accurate, especially with the non-English language material, but I will continue to try to get transcriptions figured out. Anyway, for today, I thought we would tackle, hopefully fairly quickly, so these are sort of the 5 most common misconceptions about fairies that I tend to run into. And it's not so much that any one of these is completely wrong, which I think is very common with misconceptions. It's not that they're completely inaccurate. It's that they're usually something that is true for a very specific type of folklore or a very specific type of being that we find in folklore, but not true across the entire range. So people are sort of taking something that they're finding in maybe 1 or 2 stories, or an idea that they're particularly fond of that has some basis in the material, but then they're sort of projecting it out and applying it to all fairies. So these are things that I have seen more than one person claiming, and I just want to kind of dig into what we have going on here. So look at our first one. All fairies are vegetarians. I run into this one kind of randomly, but it is one of those beliefs that I do find people have, and that people who feel this way are very passionate about. This idea that all fairies, any kind of fairy, will be explicitly and only vegetarians. This is also something that you do find reinforced sometimes in fiction or even in modern gaming. I can think of one particular game that I play myself where the elves in the game are very explicitly vegetarians. But when we look at folklore, what we find is that while there are some anecdotal accounts and some stories about fairies that either explicitly or sort of by implication prefer eating fruits and vegetables, in some cases fruits, vegetables, and some dairy. We also have a really wide range of folklore that supports fairies that are carnivorous, in some cases entirely exclusively carnivorous, or omnivorous, kind of take the human diet approach to things. So, for example, W.B. Yeats in his book Celtic Twilight, Yeats is not always the most reliable source, but putting this forward as anecdotal account, if you will, had talked to a woman who lived in Ireland whose mother was supposed to have had a friend among the fairies, and related a story about how this fairy woman had come one night and shared a meal with the family, and actually describes the meal and what's in it, and it included duck as well as vegetables. So, this is one account we find that specifically mentions meat. We also find, and this is in the Good Folk New Fairy Lore essays edited by Narvaez, we also find references to the French lutins, which is we would call them fairies in English, sort of a equivalent type of being in France, specifically the northern area of France, so that they would take people's cows and eat them, very explicitly eat them. That was the reason they were taking them. We also have accounts, for example, if we look at the German material, and I'm getting very cross-cultural with this one, but if we look at the German material, Grimm and his Teutonic, if I could speak English, that would help. Grimm and his Teutonic Mythology, Volume 4, mentions offerings to the Dochafar, the dark elves, the mound elves, that would include a bull or a cow being killed and offered, given to the elves, with the implication that they would consume or eat the animal. And, we sort of find similar concepts to all of this across folklore. We also have some more disturbing references, of course, to beings like the Ishusky, the water horses, hags, things along those lines that would actually eat people, eat humans. So human is on the menu sometimes. Those would be on the more exclusively carnivorous kind of end of things. But generally speaking, we see references to the Trows and Orkney, the Grey Neighbors, as they're sometimes called, that they would eat fish, among other, types of products, oatmeal, dairy, and fish specifically. So the idea that fairies are specifically vegetarians is definitely not something that is supported across folklore. That doesn't mean that specific types of fairies, that a specific type of being that we would call a fairy might not be a vegetarian, or that we might not have some folklore that supports one particular type being a vegetarian. Certainly, people's modern anecdotal experiences and encounters also support this kind of range. There are some people who, the beings they encounter seem to be more along vegetarian kind of approach, whereas others are decidedly not. So, the idea that all fairies are vegetarians, definitely a misconception. Moving on. All fairies are tiny. I run into this one quite a lot. It's pretty pervasive. It's particularly pervasive among people who are mostly coming to fairy belief or studying fairies and interest in fairies through that more post-Victorian, modern, pop culture influenced kind of lens. Now, to be clear, and again, this is where I had started at the beginning saying most misconceptions have some basis in the folklore and are just being sort of taken too far. We do have references to tiny fairies that go back at least 500 years, particularly in England. We have some references in Ireland to Lucarpan, what we call leprechauns today, being about 18 inches tall, which would be fairly small. But this idea of the super tiny, insect-sized, almost miniature, minuscule kind of fairies, that is something that we do find some evidence of. They are mentioned particularly in literature in England, going back to the 16th century, into the 17th century. We do have more modern folklore from the Isle of Man for a particular type of fairy. I apologize because I don't speak Manx, so I may be mispronouncing this, but they're called Murians. And they're said to be about the size of an ant. So clearly insect-sized, clearly very tiny. There are certainly tiny fairies in folklore, is the point that I'm trying to make here. However, not all fairies are tiny. We have a huge range in descriptions when we look across the folklore. We see quite a lot of material that references fairies that are human-sized, and that would be anything within a range that a human being could be expected to be the size of. We also have accounts of fairies who are giants, who are larger than we would expect, the average typical human to be. Trolls in Norse mythology are usually described as being quite large, 10 feet, 20 feet, depending on the folklore. We do see that as well in the Celtic material in some cases, the idea of these larger fairies. In England, we have accounts of beings like Jimmy Squarefoot, who's a giant, um, falling into the range of fairies, but larger than a human being would be. We also, of course, have a multitude of accounts of fairies in the form of animals, particularly horses. We also have fairy cattle, cows and bulls. And these would be the normal size for these animals in the human world. They just happen to be fairies. So when we're sort of looking across the totality of folklore, what we find is that the size of fairies can range enormously. And so the idea that fairies are always going to be tiny or minuscule or insect sized, it's really not something that's supported in the folklore. Obviously, there are some that are, but there's quite a lot that are not. Probably, if I look at my own study of the material, I think the most common range that we find is you have this segment of fairies that will be described as about the size of between a 4-year-old and maybe 10-year-old child. So say 3 to maybe 4, little over 4 feet tall, something in that general area. So there's sort of a range of fairies that are often described about that size. And then you have, again, a significant amount of material supporting the idea of fairies who are, say, 5 to 6 feet tall, roughly. So those two groups, when you put them together, to me, are these human-sized fairies, anything between 3 and 6 feet tall, we'll say, with a little variance in either direction. The minuscule ones, not as common in folklore, can be found. But the idea that all fairies are extremely tiny, sort of, if you've seen the movie Strange Magic or the movie Epic, sort of the fairies that we see there, where humans have to literally have on like magnifying glasses, or to be, in contact with the fairies, they have to shrink, magically shrink. Fairies that are that size, that tiny, much less common in folklore, and certainly not something that would apply to all fairies. All fairies are definitely not super tiny. So that's a common misconception that's pretty easily and quickly disproven with the folklore. Next we have fairies are nature spirits. This is a tricky one. I have actually done an entire 45-minute, hour-long video just about this topic, so I'm going to try to be really concise in discussing it here. Yes, we do have some accounts of fairies, particularly the more modern accounts, that describe them along the lines of what we might consider or label nature spirits. We certainly do have older folkloric material of what we might consider land spirits or fairy-type beings that are specifically tied to a natural feature like a waterfall or a location, or a natural object like a tree. We do have some evidence of this. However, there's always that however in here. However, this is a misconception. This is probably the most common misconception that I run across, because not all fairies, not all of the fairy beings that we find across folklore, across anecdotes, modern encounters, whatever, they are not all spirits of nature. Some of them don't appear to have any real connection to the human environment, the human natural world. And this sort of re-envisioning of them as eco-warriors or defenders of the natural world is extremely modern. I would trace it to maybe the 1970s or 1980s. What we find when we look across the bulk of folklore is beings who, again, enormous range, Some of them might fit these qualifications of what we would call a nature spirit, but for the ones who don't, we do have fairies that are connected to cities, urban fairies, if you will. We have many accounts of fairies who are very interested in things like human fairs, markets, um, human horse racing, human activities that would be associated with large groups of humans kind of coming together and which are not environmentally friendly, to be blunt. There's really no indication that fairies are against these sorts of things. We do have some accounts of, for example, a forest being cut down and then the fairies in that area allegedly leaving because the trees were taken down. But it's really unclear exactly what the connection between those two things is. Even in the folklore, there's no indication that the fairies were angry or there was any kind of retribution against the humans for taking the trees down. More just that they didn't want to stay there if the trees weren't there. It's kind of an open question as to how you want to interpret that. But we really don't see accounts in the folklore, for the most part, that support the idea of fairies defending the human environment. Now, there are modern anecdotal accounts. There are modern people, modern authors, modern individuals who talk about encounters with fairies, conversations with fairies, where they relay the fairies being very invested in the human environmental world and very anxious for humans to stop kind of destroying the environment that we live in. So that certainly is something that you will find. We also, however, have an amount of material where they really don't seem that concerned with these things. When we look at examples of things like roads that are rerouted because of fairy trees, for example, in Ireland, or Alpha fairy stones in Iceland, it's not that the roads are being rerouted or drilling or whatever the human activity is in question. It's not that the activity itself is a problem or being condemned, or the fairies are just against building roads or drilling wells or building houses or what have you. It's that humans are infringing on fairy territory. They're interacting with or damaging places or things that the fairies are possessive of. And so hence there are consequences to that. That is something we certainly find across folklore, but not the idea that the fairies are just blanket against any trees being cut down or any roads being built or any mining being done. In fact, there's an entire stream of folklore about mine fairies, fairies that live in and are associated with the human activity of mining, digging into the earth, looking for coal or precious gems or what have you. The fact that we have that you have this whole strata of fairies who are explicitly associated with this human activity that is not environmentally friendly, pretty much in any way, kind of shows us how complicated this topic is, and that it really isn't as straightforward as fairies or spirits of nature. It's more complicated than that. And like I said, I have an entire very long video where I really dig into this and have a lot of personal opinions. But for our purposes here today, the big takeaway is just that some fairies are nature spirits, not all of them. The idea that all fairies are nature spirits is a misconception, and it is something that we can see if we look at the folklore, is supported in some places and contradicted in others. So, something to keep in mind, or at least give some thought to moving forward. Next one, all fairies have wings. So, this is one I do run into. Again, much like with the tiny fairies thing, it seems to be coming from people who are coming from a more postmodern, post-Victorian perspective of fairies. And if you are coming from that perspective and your understanding of fairies has been heavily shaped by particularly pop culture, media depictions, Tinkerbell, some of the movies that I referenced earlier, Mary Cicely Barker's flower fairy imagery, Amy Brown's fairy imagery, anything kind of in that whole strata. People have this sort of built in image of fairies sometimes that implicitly has them with wings. Again, I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot in this one. We can support this to a degree, not actually so much in the folklore, but more in modern anecdotal accounts and things along those lines. The idea of fairies having wings actually comes to us starting in roughly the 16th and 17th century with theater, where they would put sort of these fake wings on actors and actresses in order to make it clear to the audience that they were, in fact, depicting a fairy. Particularly, this was commonly done with like butterfly wing sort of setups. And then moving forward, that idea we see starting to come into artistic depictions of fairies start to also show them with these sort of insect-like wings. Usually butterflies was very common initially. And then from there, as we move forward into the late 19th and then 20th century, we start to see them appearing in fiction, described with having these wings. So the idea of fairies with wings in general as a concept is fairly new in the grand scheme of things. We are now seeing people with anecdotal accounts of winged fairies. That shows up in the fairy census that was done by the Fairy Investigation Society a few years ago. So it is something people are experiencing now. But when we look at the older folklore and a lot of the modern folklore, and even when we look at the older art and literature, you do not see winged fairies. Yes, fairies were known to fly. We have a lot of stories of fairies flying in various contexts and for various reasons. Usually, however, this flight is more what we might describe as a kind of levitation, where they were magically traveling through the air. They did not have wings. They're not described as having wings. I think maybe the word flight is a little deceptive here for some people, but we see them moving through the air kind of on their own power. If you look at, for example, Arthur Rackham's fairy illustrations, you can find some good examples of these sort of wingless fairies, although he does also do the winged fairies because he was making his artwork at that time period when it was becoming more popular, I should say. If you look at older depictions of fairies, or if you look at depictions that are based more closely on folkloric material and older anecdotal accounts, there won't be wings. They'll just be traveling through the air. And we have various references to how they did this, usually through magical means. I won't really get into that here, but the point is that yes, they could fly, many of them, but no, they didn't have these sort of external wings. The concept of that really seems to get tied into the idea of fairies being either fallen angels or a type of demon. Angels, of course, being depicted with wings. Demons also being depicted with more animalistic wings. So we kind of get this concept coming in that fairies would have wings, and as opposed to the sort of bird wings of angels or the bat wings of demons, fairies get the insect wings. That's how that kind of rolls out. But it's not something we find in folklore, up until more recently, I will say. So I do consider that a misconception. You will still find quite a lot of material with fairies that do not have wings. Finally, all fairies are good. I run into this one constantly. This idea that fairies are these sort of benevolent, kind, helpful beings that sort of just exist to aid humanity, the evolution of humanity. And again, you certainly can find some support for this in particular places. The idea of an individual fairy acting as a guide for a particular human is something we do find in folklore. The idea of individual humans having a connection to the fairies that involved them being sort of guided or taught things or helped. We can find some evidence of that in folklore. So, we do see it. But the way that it gets sort of perpetuated and where it becomes a misconception is the idea that fairies are by nature innately or inherently good. And this seems to kind of be an overlay onto fairy folklore of the more modern understanding of angels, Christian angels, as sort of helpful, benevolent guides. Not really something we find in the folklore. Fairies in folklore are very explicitly ambiguous. Explicitly ambiguous. That's how I would describe them. They can be helpful, they can be benevolent, but they can also be malicious. And in many cases, the exact same sorts of fairies, it's not like we have an entirely separate group that's like just good and just bad. No offense to the concept of the Seelie and Unseelie courts here. But in many cases, the exact same kind of being can be any of these things. Can be helpful or neutral or dangerous to humans, kind of depending on its context and what the human is doing and what sort of mood it's in. So we have accounts, for example, of the Irish gentry that are helping people for no reason that we can see in the story, also harming people, sometimes for a reason that we can see, sometimes less so. In the same way, Scottish brownies, which get mentioned a lot as sort of this archetypal good fairy. We do have accounts of brownies in Scottish folklore causing harm. And, sometimes like grievous bodily harm. So there really is no clear cut fairies are good, inherently good beings. This is kind of also connected to this idea of fairies being more evolved than humans or sort of a more advanced kind of being than humans. That may or may not be true. Again, folklore says a lot of different things on that subject. But the idea that because they're more advanced or because they're more evolved or however you want to describe it, they are somehow purely good or have only positive intentions. That is not something that we find across folklore. In fact, that was a pretty easy one to argue against. Now, I have seen quite a few people trying to argue that fairies are, in fact, entirely benevolent and good. And the idea of them being negative or harmful is this sort of Christian propaganda that was snuck in over the last 1,500 years by the church. Pick a church. It would have been Catholic originally and Protestant later. That they, in order to get people to not have a connection to these beings or not work with them, however you want to consider it, have a relationship with them, they created these stories of these fairies being bad or dangerous or harmful to humans. So there's a couple things going on here that I think we need to unpack. First of all, this might come as a surprise to some people in the US and in other places that are more Christian dominated. Not everything around the world is run by Christianity. It's true. And while we certainly can say that Christians have had a serious impact, Christian beliefs had a serious impact on the cultures and folk beliefs of Western Europe and the related diaspora, we have a lot of other places around the globe that we can look to that have really had either no or minimal influence by Christians over the last 2,000 years. Now, not necessarily labeling them fairies, but everywhere you go, every human culture around the world has a concept of spirits, some kind of spirits that interact with humans. Western Europe, in English, we call them fairies. In other places, they call them other things. How similar or different they are to fairies, we would have to take on an individual basis. I'd not have time for that in a video, but just looking at the wider concept of humans interacting with non-human spirits around the globe, you will find spirits that are positive and beneficial to humans. You will find spirits that are neutral to humans but can be swayed in one direction or another. And you will find spirits that are inherently antithetical to humanity. They are just not in the human fan club and will cause harm or do cause harm. Or in some cases, that's kind of how they feed. So they're predatory in nature towards humans. This is a global phenomena. And honestly, trying to argue that Western Europe would somehow not have had that the pre-Christian spirits of Western Europe would only have been positive and helpful, when the entire rest of the globe and every other human culture has this diversity, is a little strange to me. I think some people are giving Christianity way too much credit, which is not to say that we don't have clear evidence of various Christian faiths explicitly and intentionally trying to demonize fairies, because we do. And that is not an arguable point. Just the fact that they get fit into Christian cosmology the way they do, generally as fallen angels or demons, literally demonizing them, not a point we can argue. But just because that is true, just because Christianity has at various points tried to make fairies, all fairies, into evil beings that good Christians shouldn't deal with, does not negate the fact that the fairies themselves have this diversity in motivation and morality and whatever else you would want to call it. So, yes, we have evidence of Christians and particular Christian faiths that have kind of not been fans of the fairies and tried to convince people that all of them are malicious. But we know that some of them would be by nature. And it's just a logical pattern that we find across the globe. If this is making sense for everyone, it would be much, much stranger if Western Europe was the only place in the world that only had positive spirits, that everything was part of that human fan club right up until Christianity came in and tried to convince people otherwise. We do have fairy beings, kelpies, hags, Ichishki, for a handful of examples, redcaps, who are explicitly malicious towards humanity 90 to 99% of the time because they're predatory towards humanity. And that's not something that's a matter of, a new religion's propaganda. That's just the nature of these particular beings. And that's something that we find around the globe, that there's some spirits that just humans are a tasty treat, and they're going to eat you, or eat your soul, or your energy, or what have you. And then we do have ones that are more helpful. And then we have a lot of them that are kind of neutral until, swayed in one direction or another. So this argument that fairies are in fact all good, and the only reason we would think differently is because Christians have kind of poisoned the well. It just doesn't hold up particularly. I would also point out, although it was written down by Christian scribes because all of the Irish material we have is, if we look at the Eisre Conla, the Adventures of Conla, which is the oldest Western European fairy story in writing, as far as I'm aware. It dates back, I believe scholars have dated it to between the 5th and 7th century in Ireland. Not that the woman of the Aishi in that story is outright malicious, but she shows up and effectively seduces the son of the king away and convinces him to leave the human world to go with her, which is not exactly a strictly benevolent action to take. Certainly, the king and all of his people do not want this to happen, and part of the point of the story is them trying to keep Conla, from leaving and sort of break her power over him. So that's going back an awfully long way, that particular story. And even into modern times, despite what would apparently be, 1,000, 1,500 years of bad press for the fairies by the Christians, we do have positive stories. We do have positive encounters. We have quite a lot of positive folklore. So if the Christian church, if their whole point was to make fairies look completely bad, even though they weren't, it's pretty much failed miserably. But we do have a lot of folklore of fairies causing people harm. Sometimes causing people harm just because they want to eat the person for lunch, literally. So the idea that fairies are all good, it really is a misconception. And I think this is a case where, cross-cultural comparison really helps us out because it makes it more clear that this pattern of good, neutral, and bad, harmful, I should say, is something that we find around the globe. It just seems to be an inherent part of human interaction with non-human spirits, that you have this diversity. So, those are sort of my top 5 most common misconceptions when it comes to fairies. I could certainly go on and do another 5 because there's quite a lot of misconceptions out there. But I wanted to tackle these in specific because these are ones that I see pretty regularly. And they're also ones, sort of when we don't discuss them, that's very easy to be perpetuated as true. And then for people to take this approach that this is the absolute truth and anyone who disagrees with it is wrong. And I think that's dangerous territory. As we've kind of shown in discussing these misconceptions, there is a little bit of truth in all of them. And the thing about fairies and the subject of fairies and the study of fairy folklore is that it's almost impossible to make any sort of set statement about fairies, about anything about fairies, because they are so liminal. They have such a wide range. Even describing them physically, you have to give these multiple descriptions of all these possibilities. Describing their morality, kind of the same thing, at least their morality in relation to humans. Anything we can say about fairies is going to come with contradictions and multiple viewpoints that can all be supported in the folklore and in anecdotal accounts. It's a huge range. So it's very hard to say any one thing and then to say that other people are entirely wrong if they believe differently. The fact is, it's just a wide range of beliefs. And there's kind of room in there for everyone as long as we keep in mind that there's room in there for everyone. We shouldn't be trying to argue that our sort of niche viewpoint is 100% correct and everyone else is wrong and they need to, get out of the room. We need to embrace this idea that it is a lot of variety and it is a lot of complications and contradictions and layers. And certainly there are things that we can say are true or not true. Either something is found in the folklore or it is not. It's kind of the point of a lot of my blogs. But the viewpoints and the understandings and the discussions, getting into the deeper nature of what these beings are, what they eat. Um, if the particular fairies that you study or you connect to or you're familiar with are vegetarians, it's entirely possible for that to be true. And it's just as possible that that's not true for every fairy out there, that we have this diversity. So I think sometimes we need to remember to respect that diversity and not to sort of wall ourselves up in one particular perspective or viewpoint, to understand that this is a huge subject and there's a lot going on with it. There's a lot to it. So hopefully this video, which has gone a little longer than I planned, but hopefully this video about the 5 biggest misconceptions that I personally tend to run into, at the moment anyway, will help everyone, give everyone some food for thought at the least, and kind of maybe take some time to look at what you believe, why you believe it, and how it might relate to the wider topic. Is it contradicted in folklore? Is it agreed in folklore? Fairy folklore is a wonderful thing because there's just so much of it, and it really is kind of all over the place. So, that said, I will try to make another video soon, and I hope everyone has a really good morning, day, afternoon, night, whatever applies. I'll see y'all next time.